Thank you, Jesse. One of the great privileges of writing a book is you get to go out and speak to all kinds of interesting audiences, and I love coming to Google. I should also let you know that I think a lot of the thinking about what power is in the 21st century, which is at the heart of the book, comes from experiences I've had consulting here at Google and working on projects in Facebook and elsewhere. So it's a great privilege to be here and to share this science and these ideas with you. I want to tell you a brief story that I came to when I was writing The Power Paradox, that you're a young audience and it'll be a little hard to imagine, but I think you'll appreciate this. In 1970, my parents did something that no parent would do in their right mind today, in today's 21st century, which is my mom had just gotten her PhD from UCLA, and we were living in Laurel Canyon, where the schools are good and the kids are healthy and everybody's going to college. And it was a really strong community, as you might imagine from that part of the world. And she got a professor job at Sacramento State University, and so she moved us to the foothills of the Sierras in 1970, where we moved my family to the poorest town in probably the poorest county in the state of California. And I moved there with my brother Rolf, and in many ways it was sort of a Huck Finn, Mark Twain type existence. We had a pond and 5 acres and ran around in the fields and got into trouble with my friends. But I noticed something that I couldn't make sense of it in 1970 when I was 10 years old. And I started to come to make sense of it when I wrote the book, The Power Paradox, which is that people in my neighborhood, although preternaturally warm and kind, and there was always a spot at the dinner table, and the parents were working very hard, the people of that neighborhood were dying young. If you start at the top of the road that I grew up on, where there were only 9 homes, the first home on the right looked like Appalachia. The floorboards in the kitchen were gone. The dad was out of work. The dad died really young. The boy came over to our swing, our rope swing in our backyard, and dozens of kids had jumped off that rope swing thousands of times. And one of the first times he jumped off it, he landed funny on his arm. His arm snapped in half, and we now know that as something called child frailty syndrome, that tends to run in really poor families. If you go across the street, there's this house, and we never saw who lived in that house. It was like Boo Radley and that famous book. And I later learned that the guy who lived there had something called agoraphobia, and I learned this in graduate school at Stanford, which is the paralyzing anxiety of going outdoors. You go down 2 street houses was my best friend, Memo Campos. His sister had leukemia. His dad got cancer in his 60s. Killed himself because he didn't want to die a death of cancer. Go a couple houses down, there were 3 families from Oklahoma. One of the moms died in her 40s, another dad died in his 60s. And I, when I grew up in this neighborhood, at the time I just thought, this is my crazy neighborhood. This is rural life. This is Penryn, California. And what I didn't know, and now we know with increasing certainty, with the science that I report on in The Power Paradox, is that these people were dying because of the effects of powerlessness, that they were marginalized in society as very poor rural people. No one went to college. A lot of kids ended up in prison. And that force in society was compromising their nervous systems. And what I'll talk to you about is an intellectual journey that finally got me to some preliminary answers to understanding why my neighbors were suffering such unusual fates. And that's what I summarize in The Power Paradox. It's really interesting, as Jesse said, 25 years ago, I've been thinking and studying power in every imaginable context for the past 25 years. And it's safe to say, 25 years ago, not only in the social biological sciences, but also in United States culture, we were blind to power differences. We thought US citizens 25 years ago thought we lived in a power-free society. We're all middle class, and we're all moving fast up to the top. That was kind of the standard American myth of the nature of hierarchy. And if you look at the social sciences, which I was raised in, of economic theory, biological science, social psychology, and the like, there was very little systematic discussion of power, right? Political scientists very interested in power, sociologists were interested in social class. But for the most part, my discipline had nothing to say about the hierarchical dimension of life. When I began this work, I was struck by this quote by Bertrand Russell in 1938, when fascism was on the rise in Europe. And the great mathematician said, the fundamental concept in social science is power, just as energy is the fundamental force or concept in physics that defines the relationships between objects. And he said that all social relationships are shaped by power as the first principle of organization. I didn't want to believe that when I was a young guy. I thought we would live in a kind of an egalitarian world of power-free dynamics. Today we know this to be fundamentally true, that romantic partnerships, many of you will have kids. Jessie is soon to have a kid. She's probably believing rather naively that this will be pure love and freedom and intimate, transcendent connection. That's true, but you are going to have a lot of power struggles with that person inside of you. So we now know that a lot of maternal diseases are based on power struggles between the developing fetus and the mom. They're competing over resources that predicts things like diabetes. Bertrand Russell got it right, and that really is what I do in the power paradox, to say, if this is the basic medium, what are the laws? What are the principles of power? And in the book, I provide 20 principles that really relate to 5 questions. What is power? How do we get it? How do we get it, be it in US politics, in at Google, if you're a 7th grader and you're dealing with the rawest of power politics, which is the grammar school playground, in power dynamics with your children and kids, how do we get it? Does power corrupt? Regrettably, I think it corrupts almost every human being. What makes for strong social systems? I'll just give you a kind of a glance at that thinking, but things like reputation really matter. And then we return to the thinking of the social biological sciences, which is, how do we think about the problems of today, right? Syrian refugees, white people in the United States living shorter lives than their parents live, white poor people, the intractable problem of poverty, and how do we think about it through the lens of power? And I'll tell you some answers to that. All right, so what is power? So when I dove into the literature, and this is a lot of smart people writing about power, the consensus would be that power is force. It's asymmetric force, right? So historians write about power as like, we invent gunpowder and we get this asymmetric advantage. In the economic thinking, power is really asymmetric capital or asymmetric information. You can think about it in political science as force through political voice and the like. And so there was a sense in the literature that power is might and force and advantage over others. But that analysis doesn't square with history or counterexamples. So let me give you 2 of my favorites that are part tongue-in-cheek. Take the average American citizen and think about who has more influence over that person's nervous system. Joe Biden, our vice president, or Taylor Swift, the pop star? Who do you think? When I posed this question recently to government officials from Hong Kong, they're like, Joe Biden? They're like, who? Taylor Swift, my daughter, And this is actually a really serious point, very relevant to the power of Google, that power scholars are making, which is the idea of force as power doesn't account for what Joseph Nye at Harvard called soft power, which is today in our information-dense world, the power of ideas and art and the written word and concepts, it stacks up very clearly with the more traditional forms of power. Who has capital? Who has the biggest guns? Soft power has risen dramatically. The idea that power is just about force and might doesn't account for this photograph right here. These are my two daughters in a younger state of existence. We're in Zion National Park, and you can do this amazing bike ride in Zion. It's 8 miles there are no cars. You go through the canyons. It is sublime. And being a psychologist, I had this great scheme because they were protesting, and you'll learn about that. I was like, all right, for every 500 petals, I'll give you a handful of M&Ms. So we're off. Their faces are covered in chocolate. And I was like, no more M&Ms. And these are the facial expressions that I encountered. Who won that negotiation? They did, right? I mean, like, I was kidding. Here are the keys to the car, have fun. Credit cards on you. But we are necessarily, and really a first task of the book, and I hope it's relevant to your guys thinking about the work that you do, is to really broaden what we mean by power, right? And I think thanks to the Googles and Facebooks and Twitters and other forms of technology, our sense of power, the real action of power, has broadened dramatically, right? And so how I define power is, and this really dovetails with other people, is power is your capacity to alter the state of another person. The state of that person could be conceptual, knowledge, emotion. It could be economic, political, physical health. It's about altering the states of others. When you broaden out and you move away from capital and military might, you suddenly have insight into how history changes, right? So these are some of my favorite examples that I write about in the Power Paradox. This is incredible. In the 17th century, in 18th century, 3/4 of the world were slaves, and literally, technically slaves. It was the central economic structure of the European economy, is slavery, and the famous slave trade. Well, this guy right here, Thomas Clarkson, probably most of you don't know about, was a college student, and he wrote an essay. He started hearing about slavery, and he wrote an essay. No one knew about slavery at the time in Europe. It won this contest. He's 19 years old. It gets passed on to the abolitionists. He then finds his way, no Google searches, to start finding information about the nature of slavery. He went to the docks in England and learned about the conditions in the slave ships, and then led a political movement that overturned slavery. And 3/4 of the world's population changed, and the economic structures of the time, from an essay, right? We take a lot of pride in the civil rights movement, the free speech movement, the protest movements that flowed out of that, radical shifts in history when you think about it. And it really can be traced back to Ella Baker and her organizing work that no one knows about in the South, that her basic social influence led to these important political influences. Here's another great one. There is no more significant influence on human arrangements, sexual arrangements, it probably in human history. I'm talking, this beats the Bible and any religious decree, which was the invention of the birth control pill. The birth control pill was led by Margaret Sanger. She got this crazy Harvard biologist who got thrown out of Harvard, Pincus. They started testing hormones and its effects on the cycle, led to the pill. Before the pill, the average American woman had six, I should qualify, had 6 children, 7 children. It compromised her life expectancy and her way of being in the world. After the pill, 2.3, right? Radical shift by a simple technology. So when we broaden out our definition of power, we suddenly get all this new insight into how the world really changes, right? As opposed to just capital and the like. All right, question 2. How do you get power? It's one of these age-old questions. And when I started my research, and it's interesting, power, how we get power in organizations like Google or other places I teach has changed in the last 30 or 40 years for the better. You probably have a lot of hypotheses why. But when I started this research 20 or 30 years ago, and I'd pose the question, how do you get power? People are like, oh, I got the answer. It's the Machiavellian answer of it's better to be what than what? It's better to be feared than loved, right? Classic Machiavellian phrase. That's Niccolo Machiavelli. He has a rather mischievous-looking smile, if you carefully analyze it. He looks a little bit like he's pulling the wool over people's eyes. And there's some question about the intentions of his intellectual work. Has anybody read The Prince? Excellent. That's amazing. So that attests to Wikipedia. When I checked this, when I wrote this, ranks The Prince as like the 32nd most influential book in human history. It's probably the most influential book on power ever written. It was bedside reading of Mussolini. Hitler was very much influenced by it. Shakespeare had characters that were built on The Prince, almost a contemporary of him. There are major schools of political thought in the United States, I will not tell you who adhere to a Machiavellian philosophy of power, how you get power. And that philosophy, and it's worth a little historical context. Machiavelli wrote The Prince. He was a Florentine politician. He got kicked out when the Medicis returned and was isolated on his second home and wrote The Prince after visiting his mistress every day. And it is some books, a lot of books, are useful during a particular historical period and outlive their reason. And Machiavelli's Italy, I suspect a lot of you have been to Italy, and it's this beautiful place where rolling hills and medieval villages, and you drink wine and you feel more kind-hearted and loving than you've ever felt in your life. During Machiavelli's period, historians rank Italy, it's probably the most violent place that ever existed in human history. It would put the Mexican drug cartels to shame in terms of just raw violence and power. And it's a theory of how you get power in very violent settings. Here are some random contemporary translations of power from the Machiavellian perspective. This is from a best-selling book. Law number 3, conceal your intentions. Law number 6, court attention at all costs. Make sure everybody you lead is always thinking about you. Law number 12, use selective honesty and generosity to disarm your victims, right? Sort of use goodness to and then what the heck? Law number 15, crush everything totally, right? And this is a massively influential theory of how you get power. There are Machiavellians everywhere I go. They're usually about 1 out of 8 or 10 people. For a little extra money, I can tell you who's a Machiavellian in your midst. But I'm kidding. But in general, it fails today. And I spend time in the power paradox talking about this. There's a pretty deep literature on this. I got a little obsessed with, I have a whole unpublished chapter on this. It tends to be a strategy people prefer who are disenfranchised in social networks. Like if I feel on the outs, I endorse Machiavellian strategies, which kind of makes you wonder about American politics. It will work in really violent contexts, and it does work a little in short-term interactions. If I get together with a group and I'm manipulating and I'm deceptive and I'm pitting people against each other and behind people's door, I'm like putting other people down, I'll gain a little notice, I'll be noticed and have some influence, but over time, people catch on to you. And then there are all sorts of data showing that it fails. The most basic and relevant to you is we can find Machiavellians, we measure them, and when you look at how they're not doing well. They don't have status, they don't have power, they're on the outs in social networks. They are not happy, they're paid less, they have lower rank. We did a study recently published where we coded the social strategies of US senators from their C-SPAN registered speeches. We actually coded their nonverbal behavior. And you can identify, if you look carefully enough, Machiavellians who actually laugh at people's suffering rather explicitly. They go like, yeah, those poor immigrants, ha ha ha, you know. We can code narcissism by facial expressions that show a lot of self-love that remind you of today's political candidates. Here's one we identified. Narcissism looks like, I kid you not. And then when that candidate became popular, I was like, oh my God, you know. And what we find is Machiavellian narcissists get disrespected by their peers in the Senate and get less support for the bills they advocate. The senators who are more courageous and humane get greater support. This is really interesting. Historians are now analyzing protest movements. Some protest movements are really Machiavellian. They're violent and have dramatic forms of torture and the like. Others are more collaborative, you know, build up big audiences, gatherings in the streets. And the more collaborative ones are much more likely to gain power across cultures and historical contexts. So this philosophy, I really feel, and a lot of historians agree, is trending downward as a means of influence. So how do we get influence? And this is where the little bit of Berkeley suffuses my thinking. I apologize, but very simply, and I'll give you a few examples. We get power by advancing the greater good. That your ability to have enduring influence in the world is most directly dependent on advancing the welfare of social networks. Hannah Arendt, who's a brilliant philosopher who came out, and some of her writings, controversial, are some of the best on power. And she saw it firsthand. She was in Germany, interviewed and interrogated by the SS, lost family, moved to the United States, knew about authoritarianism, went through the McCarthy era. She said, look, you know, your power is in your ability to stir your social network. And I think that nailed it in terms of how you gain and keep power. So as a social psychologist, I'm interested in, well, what are the face-to-face things you can do that advance the interests of others? And I'll just show you a few things that may seem counterintuitive, but I could bore you with the data that support this. People who share resources rise in social networks. It's now replicated in a lot of contexts. Mike Norton at Harvard is working on that. People who are really good listeners, and I'll show you some data, are very good at keeping power. People who routinely spread gratitude, tell good stories, gain in the ranks of the organizations that they work in. So a couple of findings that are relevant to this. This really says it all. Abe Lincoln is ranked as our greatest president with the most enduring legacy. And he was an unusual guy, didn't come from a fancy background, poor, really tall, wore funny clothes. You know, historians are, kind of pondering why he had such a profound influence compared to his rivals of the day. And Thurlow Weed, who was a journalist at the time, really got it right that, he, and I love this phrase, he sees all who goes there, hears all they have to say, talks freely with everybody, and reads whatever is written to him. He was a genius at knowing other people's minds, right? And just always gathering that information and guiding the complicated politics he navigated through. Charles Darwin, the most influential scientist in human history, same thing. He compulsively was interested in what other people thought. And most of his great insights came from learning from other people. He learned about evolution from working class pigeon breeders, who most people wouldn't talk to. He went out and discovered they were experimenting in natural selection. This is a little side note. So one way we gain power is just respecting and embracing other people's emotions. Who here is in a management position? You know, when I've taught thousands and thousands of managers, and the surprising thing about management, what's the hardest part of your job? Other people, right? Just like, handling suddenly you're a manager and it's like, wow, they're telling me about all their problems in their lives and, all the stresses at work, maybe not at Google, but, it's just part of life. And so one part of the empathetic way to power is something that was, that I had the privilege of being part of is what is revealed in this great film, Inside Out, at Pixar. I was a scientific consultant on it with Pete Dacher, the director. The central message of the wisdom, you should be listening, Jesse, of these two parents, because you will indeed have a preteen at some day in your life, is they just embrace the hard stuff and they're empathetic, right? They take on the tough stuff of Riley's life. When I asked Berkeley undergrads what they thought of Inside Out last year when we were talking about it in my emotion class, I have this student who's a veteran, he was homeless, he's a brilliant guy, he's going to med school now. He's got piercing all over, tattoos. He raises his hand, he's like, it was the darkest film I've ever seen in my life, man. And the great thing about these parents, with some little glitches here and there, is they kind of embrace hard stuff, like fear and sadness. And we know if you're empathetic, work by James Gross at Stanford, elsewhere, even just like saying, wow, this is a fearful time, or this is uncertain, calms people down, just through various interesting processes in the brain. Just being empathetic calms people down. We know that if you are mindfully accepting of difficult, stressful times, in this particular graph, you yourself feel less stress the more that you're just embracing stresses of life. And you also show a better immune profile in the inflammation response. So empathy is part of gaining power. Couple final points on gaining power, this pro-social side to it. This sums up a lot of the thinking about how good acts in organizations actually, perhaps counterintuitively, get you power. And I'm happy to take questions on this. It really summarizes this big part of the power paradox. Let me work through a little diagram here. So imagine at work here at Google, Maria expresses gratitude to Samir. Right? She's like, thanks for helping me out on that project. Well, what we know, which is fascinating, is pro-social acts like gratitude, sharing resources, giving your time, cooperating with others, actually activates, in separate studies, a very important region of your brain, the reward circuit. That starts in the ventral tegmental, produces dopamine. That dopamine projects to your prefrontal cortex and helps you do things in the environment. What's remarkable is the brain is wired to make us feel good about doing good things for other people. That, to me, that's stunning. But then the story continues, which is if Maria is expressing gratitude, she takes delight in this pro-social act. And then we know, work by Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler and others, if Samir has been appreciated, in his next interaction, he's going to be more cooperative. And there are amazing studies showing if I am generous to Jessie, she's 19% more generous in her next interaction. And then those people are 7% more generous in their next interaction, right? Good stuff spreads much more virally through social networks than bad stuff, producing greater prosociality. And then I have a section in the power paradox about how we develop really positive reputations. Your power is only as good as your reputation. We spend a lot of money on things that relate to our reputation. And your reputation is rooted in, are you producing good things for the group, right? Are you not undermining people? Are you advancing the welfare of others? And then that process of having a good reputation leads to other people thinking highly of Maria, and that motivates subsequent pro-social behavior. It's this amazing cycle that promotes your power. Now, I've tested these ideas in different ways, in lab studies and the like, and one of the ways in which I tested this to see if kind of pro-social acts makes teams better and you enjoy better power is with a rather strange experiment we did on the National Basketball Association. It's not really an experiment, it was a study. And whether really doing encouraging forms of touch, sort of encouraging people for their good play, makes teams better players. So I've always marveled. Do I have any pickup basketball players in the room? Any former basketball players? Good. At least two. I knew you would be. Of course you are. So basketball is this amazing sport. By the way, its statistics are much more complicated than baseball statistics. Don't let people, it's 5 interdependent bodies, so it's a very complicated thing. And I've always marveled at this thing that I started thinking about, which is, basketball is very aggressive and it's physical, and it really breaks down your body because you're crashing into big people all the time. And I tallied it up one day, and I'm like, I've played 3,000 pickup basketball games, from France to the projects of Brockton, Massachusetts, to Berkeley, California. And I've never seen anybody hit each other or fight. I'm like, that's more peaceful than the average family reunion in America. It's more peaceful than shopping at Berkeley Bowl, where vegans go, and I saw 2 guys with ponytails get in a fist fight over some vegetables. I'm like, come on, and I'm like, well, how could that be? And it's because of the language of touch. That touch builds cooperation where competition really should be pronounced, and it's a way in which we promote better behavior and so forth. So we did a crazy study. This was Michael Krauss, now at Yale, and I, and a very devoted team of coders spent 6 months coding one game of every team in the NBA for how much the teammates touched each other. And this is what we observed. And you can do this here at Google. High fives, fist bumps, arm embraces, bear hugs. Men like to hit each other in the head when they say good job. And it's a mystery. So those are 2 of the greatest teammates in basketball history, Tim Duncan and Tony Parker. He's rapping him in the head. Arm embraces, chest bumps, flying hip bumps. And if everything's going amazingly well and you write that great code or do that great data analysis, you fly through the hair and chest bump. And I hope you guys are doing this at work. And what we found is 2 things. The more teams did this stuff at the beginning of the season, the better they played at the end of the season. And then we could chart how individual players were these most valuable touchers. They're the great touchers, encouraging, fist bumping and the like, and they actually, through certain analyses, made their teammates play better just by directing this very important resource of touch to others. Okay, so lest you think that the idea that we get power by being good it's more true in the 21st century than it was 50 years ago. A lot of broad survey data show. But this is actually a surprising and robust human universal. This is Christopher Bum at USC has summarized 48 separate studies of, and there were anthropologists go and live with hunter-gatherer societies or foragers. They're living in the small groups in which we evolved. And then the idea is who gains power in those very, tightly organized groups that really are the conditions in which we evolved for 200,000 years. And across continents, you see this regular pattern. And here's his summary, that the leaders are generous, brave, wise, apt at resolving conflicts, good speakers, fair, impartial, tactful, morally upright. They're also strong, of course, and they're humble, right? Being good. And by the way, if you were Machiavellian and screwing people over in hunter-gatherer society, it was very common. The group would get your relatives to exile you or kill you. We did not have the luxury of that sort of destructive behavior for the group. Okay, power. We get power by empathy, by being good to others, and now we bump into why I called the book The Power Paradox, which is that power unleashes the more problematic stuff of human behavior. As Lord Acton said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He was a 19th century historian, critic of the Catholic Church and all of its abuses, and really questioned authority-based structures. I mean, you could devote a column in the New York Times to the abuses of power, and you would have new material every day, right? Roger, the Fox guy, Roger Alley's, what happened at UC Berkeley, I mean, it just goes on and on. The regrettably named Anthony Weiner, again, whatever he does. So it is a reliable tendency in human behavior, and I'm going to argue it has massive social costs. It's not just entertainment. It's not just what we make fun of. There's a lot of cost at the organizational level. Let me give you a couple of examples of how power corrupts. We know if you feel powerful, you're more likely to gamble, take risks. Studies by Christine Porath show that 3/4 of the rude, uncivil acts in organizations come from the powerful. They're the ones who are swearing at people, leaving trash, expecting someone else to, these are her observations, someone else picks it up. It just, even in very civil organizations, it produces rudeness. This is a stunning one. Somebody sent me this paper when they heard about our work. Who is more likely to shoplift? Wealthy kids or poor kids? Wealthy kids. Who's more likely to shoplift? White people or people of minority backgrounds? White people. That blew me away. We think about who we think is shoplifting. It's actually the wealthier, whiter kids who are shoplifting. They have the money to pay for it, but they're doing it. Here's a study we did early in this story of power corrupts. We brought people to the lab. We had them do something that was by design really boring. They had to write policies for the university they're at, which is my job. It was a little act of rebellion on my part. So they're writing away, and there are 3 people. We randomly assign one person to the position of power, and they're writing away. And halfway into the study, this is the key part of the study, we put down a plate of chocolate chip cookies. Everybody grabs one cookie, they eat it. Okay, I feel better. There's one last cookie. Who takes that last cookie? Indeed, the high power person's much more likely to take that last cookie than the low power people. We code how they ate. High power people are more likely to eat with their mouths open, lips smacking, and crumbs falling all over their sweaters, And I'm hoping my face is clean, by the way. So we did another study. You may have heard about this one. This got a lot of press. This is my great graduate student now at Irvine, Paul Piff. We wanted to know who's more likely to drive in an impulsive, out-of-control way, high-power people or low-power people. So here's what we did. Don't take this personally. If this, it's a very sophisticated thing. We have this very complex quantitative scale of how powerful your car is. There's the Dodge Colt from the 80s. There's a Ford Taurus, which gets a 2. There's the very middle of the road Honda Civic, very aptly named. There's a Honda Accord, I think. And that's a very fancy Mercedes. And so what we did a variety of these studies. We got a Berkeley undergrad, and he stood right at the edge of a pedestrian zone, which is that series of white stripes. It's California law that cars have to stop for a pedestrian in the pedestrian zone. A lot of people get killed in pedestrian zones in California. It's a very dangerous place. So our poor Berkeley undergrad stopped and looked at oncoming traffic, and he looked like he wanted to get across the street. And we waited until there was only one car coming toward the pedestrian zone. And our question was, who's more likely to violate the law and almost injure this guy, wealthy cars or poor cars? Here's our data. Indeed, if you're driving a poor car, you always stop, right? And I've been there. Partially it's because it's like, oh God, I got that bad tail light. I wonder if someone's going to catch me. But if you're driving a fancy car, 46% of the time, people blaze through the zone. People emailed all kinds of questions. Audi called us up. What about Audis? And Audi, we did the data analysis, not sufficient sample size, but they're actually pretty good drivers. And then we got the next one. What about the Prius? I'm sure, Prius is a fancy car, but in actuality, Priuses were the worst drivers and offenders of all. I apologize. So there we go. And then there are a lot of studies showing that power makes us lose our ability to take other people's perspectives, to empathize. This study by Adam Galinsky and Joe McGee, you're either put into a position of low power or high power, and you just have to draw an E on your forehead so the person sitting across from you can read it. So you have to flip your usual way of drawing it and draw it in reverse. Okay? Take other people's perspectives. Easy to do for low power people, harder to do on the right for high power people. Okay, so that's the power paradox, and then I'm going to give you 3 or 4 minutes of data on where I began this journey with the neighborhood that I grew up in. The power paradox is really striking. I actually think it's the most important thing you have to solve in your life, is to not fall victim. You guys are young. You will have a lot of power in your life over people at work, your kids, your partners, members of your community, and this is the central dynamic of, do you become seduced by your own power? The power paradox is, groups want really socially intelligent people to lead the groups. That's why we rise through social intelligence. Power decreases those capacities. We gain power through what is good. And then a lot of the bad stuff we read about in human history, abuses in churches, excessive military moves, the Holocaust, are abuses of power. All right, so this is, we can bring this up. This is, I have less data on this. This is how you design social systems to make them less vulnerable to these abuses. Things like collective scrutiny, accountability, all diminish the tendency to abuse power. Strong ties, things that Google does, actually diminish the abuses of power. But here's where I want to end, which is how thinking about power and powerlessness helps us think about, I think it's the central problem in the United States society today, and in part accounts for why we are in such a strange political season. One of the strangest in my 36 years of voting, so it has to do with this. I hope, that we are at historic levels of economic inequality in the United States, although that's shifted ever so slightly in the last wave of economic data. You know that 1 out of 5 American kids is raised in poverty, where the average family income is $23,000 a year. We have students at UC Berkeley, we have a lot of poor students at Berkeley, which I'm proud of, who have hunger problems, who literally, we did a big survey, a lot of our students are not eating regularly because they don't have enough money, and so we're working on that. It's endemic to our culture. And this is, I think, one of the most important branches of the social biological sciences. This is your stress system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. When you see danger in the world, the amygdala triggers a signal to the hypothalamus, goes to pituitary glands, drops down to your adrenal glands, which then secrete and release cortisol into your bloodstream. You've heard of cortisol. It's the stress hormone. And when you have a lot of cortisol, you can code until 5 a.m., no trouble. You're at peak fitness in terms of highly metabolically demanding activities. It's for fight or flight, right? And then we started to learn that chronic cortisol is one of the worst conditions for your body. it prematurely ages you. So here is where powerless comes into the equation. There are these studies first showing the single biggest predictor of cortisol release in your body is not spiders or the saber-toothed tiger out there. It's feeling disempowered. It's feeling like others are threatening you in a dominant fashion, right? It's when you're being lowered by other people. That is amazing to me. A system that helped us flee predators in our evolutionary past is really about power dynamics today. So we know, for example, if I'm African American and I hear racist words, it activates the stress response and cortisol release. We know from empirical studies, if I'm a woman and I hear sexist jokes, that activates cortisol release and the stress response. Rudy Mendoza-Denton has done studies. If you're a poor kid and you go to Columbia, where most students are wealthy, you'll feel this class dynamic, and that activates chronic levels of cortisol in your bloodstream because you feel lower than others. Sexual identity. Jen Lerner, my former student, now at Harvard, studied managers. And if you're a manager and you have a lot of power, but you don't have respect from the organization, they don't let you do direct reports, you have elevated cortisol. So the lesson is when I'm disempowered, I become hyper stressed and cortisol. And then there are new data that showing that this part of our inflammation response, the cytokine response, these are little proteins that attack pathogens in your cells. It's the common pathway to most diseases today is hyperactivated by powerlessness, by poverty and feeling shamed by other people. Powerlessness is a tremendous threat to our health. And these are just some of the effects. This is Greg Miller and Edith Chen at Northwestern. If I'm raised for 5 years in the powerlessness environment of poverty, I have elevated cortisol and cytokines and a 20 to 40% chance of dying from disease raised by 5 years of that life. Very serious issues to be taken on. Part of why I find this uplifting in an odd way is what that tells us is if we can empower people, you can solve health problems, right? Just by shifts in their nervous system. And so at my lab in Berkeley with Stacy Barrett, the Sierra Club, we're getting inner city kids from Oakland and Richmond and veterans out rafting where they feel empowered and they do the rapids and they wipe out, and their nervous systems look better at the end of the trip. And a lot of interesting interventions from there. We're in a radical time of shifting power dynamics. We are emerging out of serious hierarchy, and this is that really has been around for about 12,000 years. We're in, when you step back and think of it historically, we're in a very serious power revolution, which is really interesting. Women have more power today than they've had in 12,000 years, and the trajectory is like that, right? People, different ethnicities, the power dynamics at the national level, and then the information revolution is certainly important. It's a really exciting time to be thinking about power. You guys are a very important part of that revolution, so it's a privilege to talk to you about this work, and I hope you make the most of all the power you will have in your life and do good for the world, so thank you.
All right, thanks. We have a question from the live stream. So someone wrote in and said, you said that more powerful people flaunt the law more. So white, wealthy shoplifters, nice cars blowing through intersections. How much of that can be attributed to not power, but the ability to afford the consequences or knowing there will be no consequences? So a poor person cannot afford the fine that they probably will get. A powerful person can probably afford the fine they probably will not get.
Yeah, I think one of the shortcomings of psychology and my analysis is we don't think about the deep systemic context. And that's really true. It's like in Michael Lewis's The Big Short, who's a good friend. And, you think about like the trillions of dollars that were, lost. and the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that some people got, and there were problematic behaviors, and there's not one person has had a legal outcome. And that is a very serious commentary right now in the United States. There is Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and then Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, which is maybe the most important book of the last few years, where they're saying our systems of handing out punishments are so deeply power and class biased that's part of the story. Is I know if I drive through in the inappropriate way, but I'm in the right car, I'm okay. They're not going to look in my glove compartment, and that's part of the phenomenon. Wish I'd written more.
Just a quick question. How do you distinguish between influence and power?
That is not a quick question. That is that took me 19 years to figure out. So, and I'm sorry you thought of it in 12 seconds. So, yeah, there's been a move that most people think of our model as power as influence, right? But there are other older approaches. There are sociological analyses of like, power is just, you're part of the elite. So if I'm, at Google and I went to the right school and I'm in this position of title, my authority from those institutions gives me power. But we moved to influence because I wanted to understand human relationships, and I also think it does a fairer job of thinking about important social changes in history. Very, the Silicon Valley was created by people who didn't necessarily have a lot of money, and they went to good schools, but they did unusual things that were risky that changed the world. So I moved to an influence model of power. So they're almost synonymous.
So you talked a little bit about the impact of being powerless, having no power, and cortisol levels and health outcomes. When people find themselves in a situation where they are without power, what can they do? What research has been shown to sort of get rid of their cortisol levels, improve their overall well-being?
Well, the way people are, this is one of the biggest problems, right? 20% of our country is in poverty. Our kids is in poverty. Most of our healthcare costs, a fifth of our GDP is devoted to healthcare, are what are called frequent flyers, who are people who are in poverty who don't have a sense of power. And so I think the sense is that a new movement in the interventions is about empowerment, and that's an old idea. So take kids in the inner city and turn them into mentors or turn them into agents of change. And then I really take heart in a lot of the science that I work in, which is they're really cheap, soft interventions that are non-ideological that will really directly affect the costs of powerlessness. So I'm very committed to promoting getting outdoors because we know it has massive benefits for physical health. And then there's an ecological benefit to it as well. We know, this will sound like the Bay Area, but I'll champion it anywhere, which is mindfulness is free. It doesn't have a political party attached to it. And now it's spreading in a lot of contexts. So I always take this kind of analysis and think about what's an ideal system and how do we insert those elements into it that combat these well-documented effects of powerlessness. If I could change the tax structure, I would. If I could flow lots of money into those places, I would do that too, but it's not my bailiwick.
I was wondering if you have done any research related to tying the happiness versus the power. Is some of the dysfunctional behavior that we're seeing from the more powerful potentially related to less happiness, or is it that they're looking for some sort of hedonic thrill or something in the like there?
That's really cool. It's funny. I was giving a talk. Anyway, I'm starting to merge the power hierarchy stuff, poverty with happiness. It's interesting, and thanks for taking the class. We're talking about it with Jennifer's group later. It's interesting, the well-to-do in the United States underperform in terms of happiness. They're not as happy as they should be. Our culture is not as happy as it could be. And I think it has to do with power dynamics, that people tend to be happier in more egalitarian cultures. There are a lot of new data showing egalitarian cultures have better physical health, less in-group, out-group dynamics and stuff. So I think that one of the things that I could have, this would be a good New York Times op-ed piece, is to say, here's how power and privilege and wealth cost you, right? Which is, we show you lose a little bit of your kindness toward other people. And that's one of the most rewarding things in human life, right? When you're on your deathbed, I always think like this, and people are like, oh God, where's he going? I get to my Berkeley undergrads, when you're on your deathbed, and they're like, I don't like this class, you know. You're going to be thinking about the kind things, and that's what lasts, right? And privilege and power deprive you of that, as one example of those paradoxes that we could bring into focus. And I think the hedonic treadmill is very true. We just stop enjoying the everyday joys and focus on other things. Great connection.
All right, I think we're out of time, but thank you so much to Dacher for being here today.
Go do good.